Christie. Most of you probably remember him not from the first, the second. He's also, as you show off, he's a very famous kinodvorian. It's his third participation at the Kinodvor conference, so we're very, very happy. He had to do big sacrifices to come here. He did them. He is here and enlighten us.
Thank you, Koen. It's lovely to be here again. I have a very warm feeling about this marvelous cinema. I have a slightly less warm feeling about how I get to my PowerPoint. Can you just...
Yeah, sure.
That cursor is not easy to see.
I know.
So, I've been involved in film education of various kinds for a long time, and I've also been involved in audience investigation, like Judith. We have followed similar paths in trying to really bring the audience to light, and I edited a book back in 2012 about audiences, which for me was an important step, as Judith was saying, away from just concentrating on what's on the screen to look at who's looking at what's on the screen, and maybe not even looking at what's on the screen, because being in a cinema is a social situation, and it has been for a long time. But if you look at the history of, I think this one, there we are. The history of cinema, I'm a film historian, is, in a way, if we ask where are women, people don't talk about women in audiences until quite a lot later. In fact, the conventional picture of an audience in a cinema very quickly becomes one of young men and boys during the early years of the 20th century. But actually, if we go right back to the beginning, really the beginning, these are the two most famous advertisements that mark the beginning of moving pictures. The one on the left is Thomas Edison selling his kinetoscope. That was the first moving picture machine. Look at the picture. I usually say to my students, look at that picture, what do you see? And usually somebody says, women. Because it's really important that Edison was selling the kinetoscope in 1894 as a polite entertainment suitable for women. Women on their own, elegant women. Judith was talking about the importance of dress. You can't say for certain these were middle-class women, but I think they're being presented as middle-class women, not factory girls. But the important thing is it's okay for women on their own. This is the famous Lumière poster, very famous poster, and it's selling it as a family entertainment. So the Lumières have a clear image of their cinematograph as suitable for families. In fact, the people who went to the first Lumière shows in Paris and elsewhere were not necessarily families at all. They were often men who formed a long queue out the door. But the truth is we don't know exactly what the composition of that early audience was. The posters tell us what the aspiration was. And again, that continues. If we look at the advertising of, for instance, when Edison gets into projecting films, starts at that musical that Judith showed you, the Costa and Biles musical. He followed the European pattern. Again, he's showing quite a lot of women make up the ideal audience. And when we even move into the home movie era, the point about home movies is that you can do it at home, and it's equally suitable for women as for men. Now, we know that women did form a really important part of the audience. We don't know for sure, except for wonderful empirical investigations like Judith's account of that, the fallout from that fire. We don't know for certain what the proportions were, but we know certainly women and families were present. It didn't have the negative associations of going to the theatre, and of course it didn't have the negative associations, which was impossible for women, of going to bars and saloons. So it's really the first space where women can go socially to a paid form of entertainment. What I would say about the progress of film history especially since the emergence of feminism in the 1970s, is that it's been very focused on directors, women as directors, which I think is a pity. Of course, there were women filmmakers, not really directors, like Alice Guy and others from the very early period. And it's important to recognize that women did find a place behind the camera. But it wasn't only about directors, it was about women doing many different jobs, finding many different roles within the emerging institutions of cinema. Look at this, for instance. This is a phenomenon of around about 1908. They were called Hale's Tours. It sounds crazy. People would actually go and sit in a long, narrow room and watch a screen on which a film that was taken from the front of a train was projected. They would go for a train ride. It's insanely popular. There were Hale's Tours installations in every major city in America and in Britain. There were 2 on Oxford Street, the centre of London. Look at the picture. A lot of women. So again, we're seeing, and these photographs of audiences are really very important indeed, because it's the only way we can be certain what the kind of presence of women is. Now, I've been doing a lot of work recently about the beginnings of cinema in Britain. I've been rewriting the history of cinema in Britain, which is entirely told in terms of men. Who were the key pioneers? They're all men, of course. But actually, when you start to scratch the surface and do some research, you come up with the fact that Robert Paul, who was our pioneer, as I have been arguing, was married to a woman who had been a dancer and a performer at the Alhambra Music Hall. I've produced a graphic novel, as well as a big book, about the beginnings of cinema in Britain, and I can use the graphic novel to reinsert Ellen Paul back into the history, because for sure she was with him when he created the first film studio in Britain. And in fact, when he dies in 1943, one of the people who writes his obituary says, and of course his wife Ellen, with her theatre experience, ran the studio. So here we have somebody who was really a studio manager and a producer, but of course she's not recorded in history, unless you do it in comic strip form. So I'm trying to correct the history to broaden the range of things that women did. And there's been some research recently, which is happening in Domitor, the Society for the Study of Early Cinema, about the importance of these factories that were created in the early 1900s to colour films, entirely staffed by women, entirely managed by women. All films were seen in colour in the early 1900s. Unfortunately, the colour versions have not survived, so we tend to think of them as being in black and white, but they weren't. They were in colour, and they were coloured by armies of colourists. First of all, it was done by hand. You can see the Pathé colour film works there, and then it was done by machines, by a stencil machine, but not a man in sight. So a great deal of the industry of cinema was being actually staffed by women during this period, and that again has been really left out of film history for a long time. So my second area is to really try to map the female part of the audience. This is another picture I show to students regularly and leave it on the screen and say, what do you see? They say, well, right, there's a drink. Yes. The chairs are not integrated into a row. No, they're canvas chairs. This is typical, the informal seating. This is not you can tell by the fashion that this is probably what? 1930s, 1940s? For sure. I mean, you have to look for social indicators. But of course, there are women present in the audience. Not so many, but almost all are men. That photograph has been set up to show one attractive-looking woman in the foreground. The rest are all men. So it's a posed photograph. It's not a photograph we can rely on for evidence. But this is what we can rely on for evidence. Advertisements from the trade papers, and like Judith, I use these a great deal because they tell us the commercial reality. And here we have, from the great period of opening the large cinemas, 1912, 1913, these are the second generation of cinemas, the first real purpose-built cinemas in London, for instance. And you can see here, which is, I think, very interesting, the grand reopening, children's matinees, yes, they're cheaper, 1 penny. Every child presented with a packet of sweets, they're trying to grow the next generation of audience. Every lady with a novelette. There's a marked trend at this period. Managers were told that you must attract a higher class of audience and you must try to get women, make women an essential part of the audience. And so there's a whole move to offer inducements to women. A novelette, little paperback book in your hand. They started stopping the cinema show, putting up the lights and handing tea to people in the row. This was very fashionable around 1912, 13, 1914. They would just stop the film arbitrarily and serve tea. Later they would develop cafes, but there wasn't room in a cinema at that time to have a cafe, so you just gave people tea in their seats. And here you get another stage, just a couple of, well, really the same period, of trying to really upgrade the social status and the comfort of a cinema. In Hampstead. Hampstead is a relatively middle-class area in London, middle-class, upper-class, the most comfortable picture theatre in London. And music became important. It wasn't just going to see the film, it was the quality of the music that was accompanying the film. So we have a first-class orchestra, and you find that a number of cinemas are focusing on the music. It's not just a piano, it's not just an ordinary little band. It's a real orchestra, and women's orchestras, all female orchestras, were actually very popular at this time, interestingly too. Postcards are a very important source of evidence. The postcards really explode at the beginning of the 20th century. There's a new technical facility, it's called the divided back. So this is the postcard that we all know today, where you have the address and a message, you turn it over, and of course you have an image. And thousands, hundreds of thousands, probably millions of these were published. And if you analyze, the collectors can tell us, fortunately, how many were produced. This is a very popular genre. These are pictures of cinema going with a kind of sexual innuendo, but they're also rituals of courtship. So the cinema becomes absolutely central to the rituals of courtship, how women meet men, men meet women, in the early 20th century. And there are literally hundreds of images like this with more or less explicit statements. Okay, that's a more explicit one, that's a less explicit one, but somewhere between these, this is a very popular way of picturing the cinema-going experience. We have to assume that these people are not going primarily to see the film. Now, the beginnings of trying to analyze the cinema audience are in Germany. One of the pioneer sociologists in Germany, Emily Altenloh, publishes a study of the sociology of cinema based on her work in Mannheim. It came out in 1913, 1914. And she's very interested in the young male audience who like adventure, thrills, things that break taboos, as you would expect. But she has something to say about girls' tastes. The films that most appeal to girls are of a syrupy and sentimental type. That is rarely shown, especially in children's screenings. When girls go to the cinema, it is seldom out of pure interest in any particular program. Rather, they enjoy it merely as they do any other excursion that they make with their parents. Boys, on the other hand, usually make their own decision to go to the cinema. They like to go with friends. Neither do girls get so caught up in what they are watching. The stimulation they experience at the theatre or at concerts seems less restricted. So Emily Altenloh, a woman herself, an early sociologist, is really drawing sharp contrast between why women why girls go to the cinema and why boys go to the cinema. Boys take a lead, they make the decision, they go with groups of other boys. Girls go because they're asked or because they're taken by their parents. They have less volition, less investment in the program. So this is the beginning of a kind of gender stereotype that gets repeated. There are many, many studies done in subsequent decades about the cinema, which is often regarded, certainly in northern European countries, as a place where bad habits are taught to young people, especially boys. So here you get a typical dialogue from a 1917 report in Britain. What do you like best at the cinema? All about thieves. Charlie Chaplin, of course, has taken over the cinema at this point. Massively popular. Yeah? Mysteries and Charlie Chaplin, where stolen goods are hidden away in vaults that the police can't get them. Cowboys, and then Charlie Chaplin. When you've seen these pieces showing thieving and people catching the thief, has it ever made you wish to go and do the same thing? Yes. The judges and police authorities and guardians of public morals were very keen to prove that the cinema was a factory for manufacturing young hoodlums, young thieves. It's a very popular theme. Cinema is bad news. This is produced by the National Council for Public Morals, which is not a government organization. It was an entirely spontaneous creation of people who thought that they should police public morals. You find this in other countries too. I mean, I'm just taking the British example, but you find it replicated in many, many countries across, especially Northern Europe and in America. There's a big morality drive to... and the morality drive reaches its climax with the Paine Fund, which is an American foundation which funds research, empirical research on audiences. And they fund a Chicago sociologist, Herbert Blumer, to write a really important study, Movies and Conduct, in 1933. This is one of the first serious studies of the film-going audience. He's one of the great figures in Chicago sociology. And he does it by getting people to write autobiographies. This is the most interesting form of research through the 1930s and 40s and 50s. I think it's still actually a very interesting tool to get people to write down, in this case, what the cinema has meant to them. And the stuff that Blumer collected is fascinating, because what you see, in short, is girls, especially, learning to be women through going to the cinema. It becomes not a factory for creating thieves and hoodlums, but it becomes a factory for teaching girls how to be a woman, how to be a sophisticated woman, how to model themselves physically and in their behavior on the idols they see on the screen. That fits very well with what Judith was describing. So we're talking here about a slightly later period, later than the Nickelodeon period, actually later than the silent era. But you can see here, I got some comfort out of being Mary Pickford in our games and improved my appearance with the aid of wood shavings to get artificial curls. I was also very fond of old-fashioned clothes, which I'd first seen in the movies. I love to dress up as an old-fashioned lady. So these, and there are many, many of them which Blumer drew upon, I think give a really interesting idea of the fashioning of womanhood through, through intensive cinema going, which of course is typical of this period. And the 1940s is the climax of cinema going everywhere in the world. There are more people going to the cinema more often in every country right across the world. 1946 is kind of the climax of cinema going. Another kind of source, which we've talked a little bit about, photographs of the auditorium that focus on the cinema. Weegee, one of the pioneers of candid photography, took a whole series in New York in the 1940s of what people are doing in the cinema. How did he do this? He used infrared. So there's no flash involved. These are real photographs of real people like you, taken without you knowing it, by using infrared. And they're really very interesting indeed. There are lots of them. You can find a lot of them online because they show literally what people were doing in cinemas when they were not being watched or sitting posing for a photograph. So I think we can learn quite a lot from these about audience behavior. So my next chapter, as it were, is to look at what I would call modern research. Now, this is a big subject, and I'm only going to give you a few snapshots from it. One of the sources of data that we all have access to, I'm sure everybody here has used IMDb. At some point, it's one of the things you do. If you want to look up a film, you go online, and you can, the largest interactive database is IMDb. It started in Britain as a very small organization. Actually, it started at Watershed, which is a cinema in Bristol, in one room, and now it's owned by Amazon and has a global reach. But the great thing about IMDb is that behind the data, the information about the cast list and so forth, there's a huge amount of statistical information which is gathered by IMDb and its signed up constituency. And anybody can access this. I'm surprised at how little people use it, because it's all there for free. Just go one step back and you can see it all. So what does it tell us? Well, it's a famous joke in audience research that the most popular film in the world for a very long time has been The Shawshank Redemption. Never won any prizes, but in terms of audience votes, it has been for years insanely popular. More people have voted The Shawshank Redemption as the best film ever. More people have watched it repeatedly, again and again and again and again. So it's a kind of unknown film that is a universal favorite. Now look at the demographic breakdown, okay? You see it's got a lot of votes, 1 million votes, 1,186,000 votes, okay? By demographic, ages, okay, right there. So pretty level, actually. Up to 18, 18 to 29, 30 to 44, over 45, pretty level. Males, females, very similar. This is interesting. So one of the things that makes it a truly popular film, though it's an entirely male-centered story, is that it's got these astonishingly similar, except that only 29,000 women over 45 have voted for, as 144,000 men have. So you can begin to work out here that, of course, the numbers voting of women are always much less. Much, much less. So it requires some interpretation, but what it shows us, I'm just giving you a kind of working example. Now here, for instance, that's The Shawshank Redemption, okay, with its scores over there. Let's look at Mamma Mia. Mamma Mia is believed to be a film that primarily appeals to women. Individual women, groups of women. Anybody who runs a cinema will tell you that large parties of women tend to go and see Mamma Mia. It's a kind of party film. And indeed there is now a stage show based on that principle, again aimed entirely at groups of women. So what do we find here? Okay, it has got higher votes by women, higher, 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 all the way along, higher votes by women. Significantly higher proportion of IMDb users. Overall in IMDb, there are many, many more male registered users than women, so the women's votes are always lower. But the proportion of women's votes for Mamma Mia are quite high. Gone with the Wind, interestingly too. Gone with the Wind, again, is a classic example of a film which had very strong female appeal right from the outset, from 1939. And it remains a very highly voted film. And again, you can read the kind of figures here. You can see that, for instance, the women's votes, over 45 women's votes, are much higher than the men's. So you can get quite a lot of information from IMDb, remembering always that it has a built-in bias towards North American males. Overall, the proportion of registered users is quite heavily biased towards that. But if you make allowances for that, you can still read differential scores. Now, I was involved in doing a study back in 2011 for the British Film Institute, which, and the UK Film Council, which was one of the best funded empirical studies there has ever been. So although it's now getting a little old, it came out in 2012, I still think it's really interesting because most polling of audiences, most audience studies have been actually commercially funded, or they're very small in their scale, because it's expensive, it takes time. We had a vast amount of money to do this. The Film Council and the BFI gave us £250,000 to do a really big study, which is not biased by commercial considerations. We weren't trying to sell ice cream. And we were able to construct a model of the total UK population by age, by location, by gender, etc., by ethnicity. So it's one of the very few times when you can actually work with a very large sample of over 2,000 people, which has been scientifically constructed. So it's, as far as it goes, it's good. It's reliable. You can believe what you see in it. I used to use this, Cohen will remember this, to scare people, members of Europa Cinemas, to remind them that the actual proportion of viewings of films that happens in a cinema is only 6%. That was then. That's in 2011. It's a very important 6% because it drives the value chain of cinema, but it's only 6%. We estimated that there were 5 billion viewings of films back then in all kinds of situations. This is really at the beginning of the tablet era. A tablet had only just been launched at this time, and people didn't know what tablets were for. What is this strange object? Then they discovered what they're for, watching movies, mainly, and television, increasingly. But if we did this again, of course, we would get a different proportion, but I still think it's quite instructive. For instance, we included, most films are actually watched on television screen, and that continues to be the case. That's really important. DVD and Blu-ray, well, the DVD has been pronounced dead for more years than I can remember, but it doesn't die. It keeps on going. Most DVDs, of course, are watched on a TV screen. Download and streaming, that, of course, has increased massively. That was only 8% then, but now it would be enormous, obviously. The cinema is that 6%. Would it still be 6%? Mobile device, that would be much bigger. More people using their phones getting bigger. I think on a plane is really interesting. A lot of people watch movies on planes. They used to watch them on the back of a seat. Now they increasingly watch them on a tablet or on their phone, which they take with them. So this is a really important part of the audience because people watch different things on planes. They don't watch the films that they would watch down below. They often watch guilty pleasures. I've asked people what they watch on a plane, and they watch films that they would not wish to be seen watching. I saw Mamma Mia on a plane when I was crossing the Atlantic, and I arrived in New York, and my host was the person running the City Opera of New York, and I said, I've just watched Mamma Mia. And she said, I've just seen Mamma Mia too, isn't it great? So we had this kind of interesting conversation about a film that we wouldn't really wish to confess that we had seen. So guilty pleasures is watching films in flight, I think. Anyway, this is some of the back data in that study, Opening Our Eyes. There's a lot of data. If you're really interested in these things, go online, go to the British Film Institute, and you'll find all the data has been put up online. And again, people haven't used it as much as they could. There's a lot of really interesting information. So what do we get from this? Well, interestingly, the way we framed the questions for that study, we didn't really focus on gender. And maybe that's a sign of the times. In 2011, gender is present in a lot of the questions, but not as much as you would expect. I think if it was being redone, we would focus on it differently. But there is some. So, for instance, there's 53% of men versus 40% of women. Their preferred genre is a blockbuster. Okay? That's men, that's women. Okay? Red, purple. Films without big budget special effects, but with famous cast members, more women than men. So it appears to suggest that women are more attracted to stars, popular figures, than men. And there's some other evidence that supports that. Animation these are insignificant differences. They're not, they're within the, sort of the margin of error. We had 3 questions in the questionnaire where we invited people to actually speak or write about their preferences, and these are really interesting. So we have 2,500 of these little snapshots of what people really think about movies that matter to them. And this is a kind of harvesting. I just summarized this here. This is all the data, difficult to take in quickly, but basically comedy, drama, action, adventure, suspense thrillers are all favored by over half. Women preferred romantic comedies, family films, romances, and musicals. Men, stronger preference for science fiction, action, adventure, and horror. Are we surprised? I mean, there's a significant trend towards women being interested in horror movies, which has been noticed and catered for, I would say, in the last 5 years. So that this is post that. There is definitely a women's horror audience. Foreign language is the same. Minority ethnic backgrounds, again, we were the first people to actually investigate this in Britain, and we find that there are quite striking differences. Romantic comedies, 54% versus 39%. Romances, these are major differences. They're quite significant and quite interesting, and they would repay further study. But of course, there are interesting exceptions, and that, to me, looking at the study, I wrote part of the report on it. There were interesting exceptions to gender stereotyping. So, for instance, Juno. A man picks it out and is really, really interested in what he finds in it. And I wrote the section on Avatar, which was still a relatively new film. And my theory is that Avatar has an enormously wide appeal, which included women, included older people as well as younger people, and a lot of ethnic minority people. Avatar is a very open film, which of course has a massive audience, but it was by no means confined to the typical male action adventure, not at all. In fact, it was a film that people could read into all sorts of personal interests. And for instance, that's one of the many deviant but interesting responses to Avatar. And here are just one of the films that was very, very popular amongst many people for this study was Slumdog Millionaire. These studies are always biased in terms of recent films, so Slumdog Millionaire had just won a lot of prizes, Oscars, so it was in people's minds. So there's much more comment on it than you would expect today. But these are quite interesting. I picked these out. 65, 7-year-old northern woman. I hated the poverty and corruption, but loved the romance and the music. Able to kind of see the film under 2 headings. An Indian woman in London, very moving and entertaining. 25 to 34-year-old woman in southeast England. This is a rather good upsum of the emotional roller coaster. I thought it was a comedy and not a reflection on poverty and slavery and abuse. It provoked strong emotions in me. I found myself sobbing through parts of it. It was very well acted and directed. Still think about the film now, even though I saw it a year ago. So that's really interesting description of what the kind of personal, emotional experience of a film like this can be for someone. We found that people remembering films they'd seen 20, 30 years ago, which still brought out an emotional reaction. So one of our themes was that films don't just have an immediate reaction, they have a long-term reaction. And the fact that we can now own a film on DVD or means that, of course, we can revisit the film at different stages in our life. So this is the kind of work of results you can get from a study like Opening Our Eyes. Now, just a very quick word about 2 kinds of further kinds of research. There are many kinds of audience research today. This is questionnaire-based psychological research, okay, from 2015. Sex differences in emotional evaluation of film, interaction with 5 high arousal emotional categories. This is a study done by Italian researchers. Self-evaluation showed no effect of the gender factor, a main effect of emotional category. This indicated in post hoc analysis greater ratings, pleasantness, for erotic and scenery compared to neutral film clips, and lower ratings for compassion and sadness. So basically what they're trying to find out is if women and men are blue, women are red, if there are essentially gender differences in response to erotic subject matter, scenery, neutral, sadness, compassion, and fear. These are very crude categories, obviously. And, we might all disagree with the clips they chose, but you can see what they're trying to do. They're trying to test that old assumption that men and women do have different responses to filmic material. They're not really coming up with very strong differences. There are slight differences, but they're not very significant. Here's a little bit more detail, but it doesn't have a conclusive outcome. In particular, women reported fear clips as more unpleasant compared to men. Okay? Women rated fear clips as significantly more unpleasant than compassion, sadness, and neutral. A different pattern was found for males who did not show any difference among neutral clips. And the three negative categories, compassion, sadness, and fear, they rated the erotic and scenery clips as being more pleasant than all the other. So this suggests that there's a kind of greater, if you like, arousal threshold for men in relation to these categories. It's difficult to process this, but it's not showing massive differences, it's just showing slight gender-dependent differences. Further into it, another interesting area of audience research is to use neurology, neuroscience, and to use brain mapping, either by fMRI scanning, which is kind of expensive to do. Some work has been done on this to actually do real-time fMRI scans of people when they're watching film. It's very difficult to do in Britain because you can't get access to a scanner unless it's for a medical reason. One of my daughters is a neuroscientist, and I've been trying through her to get access to some MRI scanning facilities because I think this is potentially a very interesting area of research, but it's mainly been done in Israel and in America. So I'm just going to give you some time to look at it. Maps of neural circuitry show that on average women's brains were highly connected across the left and right hemisphere, in contrast to men's, where the connections are typically strong between front and back. Okay? Women are better at intuitive thinking, remembering things. When you talk, women are more emotionally involved. They will listen more. So these different patterns of connectedness in the female and the male brain do have an eventual consequence in relation to how, for instance, women talk, remember, observe, and relate to experiences they're having, including film screen experiences. It's very difficult to summarize some of these studies, and interestingly, most of the big MRI studies have not been focused on gender. They've been looking at age groups, but they have not tended to take gender as a key issue, which is, it might be interesting if some of them had been, but not as far as I know. So back then to the statistical analysis. This is the easy bit, using IMDb, because it's free and accessible. So basically that shows that there's one breakdown. There's a lot of analysis of IMDb figures, but basically these are the most gender-divided titles, or a selection of most gender-divided titles. So a film, Middlemen, Dumb and Dumber, Freddy Got Fingered, The Wild Bunch, those are more preferred by men. Okay? Maybe not a surprise. And these are more preferred by women. There's a lot of interest in doing this kind of work has focused on the Twilight series, which is assumed to be primarily of interest to young female audiences. Sex and the City, obviously. So Twilight figures a lot in that. And interestingly, 50 Shades of Grey. How many people here have seen 50 Shades of Grey? Can I have a show of hands? Right, a few timid hands. I have a number of photographs I took on trains when 50 Shades of Grey was first released as a book of people reading it. Entirely women, visibly reading it. It's considerable numbers. It's quite interesting. So this is a film which very, very few men either have seen or will admit to having seen. Very gender diverse. So this again comes from IMDb. It's worth noting the caliber, the status of films on each list. Where women's votes are much higher, the films are mostly mediocre blockbusters. Men's preferred films are much more diverse. So what we see is this old idea that women prefer rubbish films, which goes back a long way. It's embedded in the kind of tradition. How true is it is another matter. So does this analysis, here's one of these ways of representing female-skewed films, which do poorly in terms of their votes, which is something that IMDb collects. Okay, so you see that Shawshank Redemption and The Godfather are very, very high on IMDb, Lion King, etc. But Cinderella Story, Pride and Prejudice are way lower. So does this back up decades of assumptions that women's pictures are artistically inferior to men's pictures? But, of course, what I would want to say is, what about the revaluation of melodrama, which started in the 1970s, which was absolutely at the forefront of feminist film theory? My friend and colleague Laura Mulvey made her name through working on the despised women's films of the 1950s and 60s, the films of Douglas Sirk, for instance, and Minnelli. So women's melodrama was absolutely at the forefront of the emergence of film theory in the 1970s and 80s. This is just my last slides. This is just something I picked out of the discussion of this issue, very recent discussion. This is a writer in the journal Quartz. Oops, sorry. The point is not the tragic undervaluing of Twilight and 50 Shades of Grey as works of art, but they're examples of a broader effect. Male and female critics differed in their opinions of other movies as well. And I think this is really interesting because all the evidence that we have is that critical opinion, I don't mean serious critics, I mean people who just write things up in newspapers and online, do have an enormous influence on the films that we want to see. If a film is highly regarded, we keep reading that people think highly of it, then we tend to go to see it. It's a simple fact. But what about the gender of the critics? So what Emma Pearson is arguing is that, for instance, 78% of female critics liked Love Actually, but only 58% of male critics did. 80% of male critics liked The Wolf of Wall Street, but only 57% of female critics did. I've done a lot of work on Martin Scorsese's films, and I've often asked audiences, mixed audiences, but I'll ask you again, how many people here, since we have a majority of women in the hall today, how many people have seen on a big screen Raging Bull? Okay, that's interesting. It's distinctly less than half. I've known many audiences, particularly women, who absolutely none have seen Raging Bull because many people are convinced it's a film they would not want to see and they would find shocking, unpleasant, distressing. And to some extent, The Wolf of Wall Street perhaps falls into that category. So there are definitely, obviously, gender differences, as my wife says to me. You know there are. Why are you making a big thing about it? But it is important that we try to get to the bottom of this through different measures, and I'll just end with this. So this is a recent editorial piece by a very famous figure in the film world, Manohla Dargis, who's the New York Times film critic, a very important figure in terms of setting the critical tone. And what she's writing is, she's writing in the aftermath of the Me Too rolling scandal in America. And her title is What It's Like to Be a Female Movie Critic in the Me Too Era, which I think is probably a question that's in many of our minds. Among other things, this year's torrent of truth-telling has underscored how much ordinary, unremarkable sexism, nothing extreme or criminal, women need to deal with just to get through the day. It's pervasive, seemingly trivial choices. The movies may offer us the promise of fleeting escape, but any woman can tell you this getaway can feel distressingly elusive when a film is in lockstep with the worst that the world gives us. And what she chooses to illustrate her article, for instance, is a big hit film of the other year, Black Panther, which of course was considered to be an important film in terms of ethnic representation in America, a superhero film that had black stars. But, as she says, the women who serve Black Panther's male-driven story, and she draws her own conclusions about exactly how these are being represented. It's not that I'm noticing sexism more, I always noticed it. It's that I'm not gliding over the insults and the insinuations, the snickering and the unmotivated female nudity as easily, as resignedly as I sometimes did. I think that's quite a good end note, so I'll stop there. Thank you.